pedophilia is this ick factor that is painted as rational. The ick factor is there for a reason. It's because incest is fucking disgusting. That's not some weird, authoritarian attitude that we just all happen to have. It's there because fundamentally, incestual relationships are generally very damaging to people involved. So that taboo exists for a reason. And we don't think that just challenging taboos is a reason to encourage brothers to go on and carry on with their sisters. The other thing I want to do is go to eugenics. And Kelly told you that the state will never tell people when they shouldn't have children. Well, Kelly, the state already does. Like, people who are over 40 or have other genetic diseases already are denied IVF. So I think the state already tells people whether or not they should reproduce. So, what I'm going to talk about now, before we get to the more social things, I'll talk about why incest basically doesn't ever exist in an incestuous relationship. It's not consensual, rhyming. And secondly, why the relationship is bad once it exists. So in terms of consent, Kelly wanted to give you analogies like homosexuality, fun, friendly things that we all love, like gays. But the real analogy here is things like bestiality and rape. Because in those situations, people involved can't consent. And what this point is about is that just because a man can say, oh yeah, bro, harder, instead of not being able to talk to an animal, that same consent doesn't necessarily mean consent exists. Because fundamentally, incestuous relationships are a conflation of the family structure and the sexual structure. So we think that consent can never properly exist when the sexual liaison or the sexual relationship is initiated from within your family structure. Because there are existing psychological relationships there, there are existing very strong social links there that make the dynamics completely different from other romantic relationships. Basically what that means is that we don't think there's really any situation where a brother and sister who grew up together can then decide to have a sexual relationship without there being severe psychological consequences, and without both parties fully consenting to the relationship. The thing here is that the trust is built. The trust is not built, rather. It's not built. Not built, I say. The trust is not built. It's exploited. When I happen to lock eyes with Justin over the lectern, we can build trust and have a relationship. But when Justin and I have grown up together as brother and brother, that trust, we're exploiting that trust by having a sexual relationship, not building it like in a normal relationship. The second point, very quickly, is why it's bad once it exists. Basically because the more exploited party in the relationship is trapped, because it's hard for them to get advice, and it's hard for them to leave. Because when you initiate a sexual relationship with someone fundamental to your life and your social structure, like, say, your dad or your sister or your brother, we think it's extremely difficult for you to seek advice about that relationship because everyone around you is invested in that relationship. It doesn't an incestuous relationship in your family between, like, your sister and your dad. Like, if you thinking that's normal, you're totally invested in keeping that going, and you're not able to give good advice to the person there. That person has very little recourse for help outside that close community. And that also means it's much, much harder for them to leave. Look, laws exist to shape the world we live in. And the kind of world that we don't want to live in is the world they want. The world where people call their daddy, daddy.
Michael, for a speech and call upon the second speaker on the Amenity team, Chris.
I should point out I'm Michael's employer, so I'm glad he stopped what he did with his analogy. Ladies and gentlemen, what you heard from Michael just then was the ravings of a crazed eugenicist. Someone who's willing to change around whatever they can do with nature, to play God, just to meet their cruel and bizarre moral standards. And you saw it, most of all, when he was so willing to refer to his golden standard of how normal people breed as through IVF. Which I'll get to in a second. But I just want to talk about some general ideas he raised. One is the entire concept of consent, and his assertion that the real issue here is to draw parallels with bestiality and rape, which we kind of accept but kind of refute in that order. Secondly, this whole idea of the it factor, and then for me to talk about my own little points, which are about when you actually do intervene in minority fetishes like homosexuality, and when you actually try and look at basic points of where the cultures have developed to deal with these certain situations. So one of the ideas is consent. Michael's problem was that when you are engaging in a sexual relationship with someone in your family, there are existing psychological issues, there are existing social relationships. In no other relationship you could possibly have with anyone else, apparently, do these relationships exist before you might engage in a sexual one. So we refute this entirely. You could be about to engage in a long-term relationship with a friend of yours, with someone you work for, with someone you've dealt with every day, the lady at the post office who gives you a wink every time she gives you a parcel. All these people who exist in your realm of consciousness, who you might have some sort of psychological understanding with, you could go into a relationship with. But more importantly, the kind of profound psychological damage that Michael was so afraid of is the same profound psychological damage that could occur when someone you're completely in love with rejects you, when someone who you have been dating for 5 years or been married to for 20 years decides to divorce you. All these things that can cause you profound psychological damage, finding that you're too short to go on a roller coaster. All these things that might exist in life that might make you a bit sad, to give you psychological damage, the government doesn't stand in and try and defend you. Secondly, Michael raised this issue about bestiality. And I'm going to talk about this in my substantive, but I'll bring it forward now because I think it's extremely important. We would say that bestiality is again something that the government should completely legalise, provided that you can clearly show the level of consent exists from the animal. Some enlightened states, we learned a couple of months ago, the ACT has no law against bestiality when footballers are doing certain things with peanut butter. All of these ideas are really basic ones that show that they're at the forefront of the cultural revolution in terms of realising basic elements of liberty and freedom and consent. We think those of these are incredibly important and it's all part of the same thing. So we really basically say that bestiality point's completely irrelevant. In terms of the ick factor, this incredibly and profoundly irrational ick factor has developed around incest. In the same way that I have weird issues with spiders and yogurt and feet, I don't think that that's really any way to run social policy. So to try and say that you have developed this issue of ick factor, the same ick factor that probably existed about homosexuality as recently as 20 years ago, or 15 years ago in Tasmania, and other issues like that, there's just no basic idea of doing it. Finally, Michael's idea was that the government does intervene to stop people having children once they're over the age of 40 because they won't provide IVF. We say that's just a complete mischaracterization of the situation. We don't, then intervene with our witch-doctory skills to create children once you're over the age of 40. We don't withhold the ability to breed, unless we're living in sort of Logan's Run or something like that. So finally, this idea about cultural credit, which is my substantive material, I've got 10 seconds left, so I'm talking about that. There are two basic ideas here. One's the rational, one's the irrational. The rational idea is that you're trying to avoid mixed bloodlines to cause severely disabled people. We live in a society that is advanced in a way that is able to care for these people, in a way that they weren't even 10s or 20s of years ago, because that's basic unit of use. Once we have those abilities, there's no basic reason, as Kelly was talking about, for us then to prohibit these people to breed, because we can care for their children. They're not going to be the devil's children like they were in the 1500s. The second, as I've already talked about, is the irrational one, the ick factor, the one that's based on no idea other than some basic recoiling of some priest somewhere because it doesn't conform to this small view of the world. So if you want to go with the small view of the world as espoused by Michael, by all means follow the negative side, but if you want one that's at the forefront of liberty and freedom and what society and sexuality should be, clearly the affirmative side is carrying the day so far.
Chris for a speech and call upon the second speaker of the negative team, Vinny. Chris just blatantly lied to you. He just said this was like intervening in minority fetishes like homosexuality. Chris has been around debating longer than I have, ladies and gentlemen, and he should be the first one to tell you that in this community, that is not a minority fetish by any means. I want to talk about two things in my rebuttal. Firstly, consent. Secondly, this idea of when we should intervene and when we shouldn't. And then in my substantive, I'm going to look at social isolation. And then lastly, I'm going to touch on some medical issues. So, in terms of consent, what we told you in Michael's speech is that the relationship that you have isolated to you is different. You don't just look over the table and fall in love with somebody. Why? Because the people who are in your family are responsible for you in many different ways. Just like your parents are responsible for keeping you safe, your brothers and sisters are responsible for engaging in a familial life with you. This isn't like a kid you see at school for 6 hours a day and then you go home. This is someone you've seen all of your life. This is someone who has that level of influence and responsibility over you. We think that is a problematic factor. Then he said, well, this is like psychological damage. It's equal to somebody dumping you. But the reality is, in an incestual relationship, that's often not the kind of thing that happens. Why? Because there's such huge influence over one party to the other. There's such huge problems in getting out of that cycle. This is the analysis Michael brought you about why people can't leave. Because the people in their families do have such a high influence over them. They feel like it's all they've known, they're told that it's right, they don't have opportunities to get advice, they can't see that abuse is happening, ladies and gentlemen, and that's particularly problematic. And then he said, well, if we could decide if animals were consenting, bestiality would be fine. That's not the case, ladies and gentlemen. We think that this is about equality. It's about both sides being able to come to the table of the relationship equal and with the same understanding. That certainly doesn't happen in bestiality, and it definitely doesn't happen in incestual relationships, and that's where the line is drawn. So, in terms of whether we intervene or not, we would say that we're not trying to simply avoid bloodlines. There are good reasons for this, and we think they're in two categories. So the fact that it harms those people who are involved and it harms their families. So we think that it is important to be tough on this issue because in the long run, we get benefits. This isn't about a small view where we say that a few potentially disabled children might be born. Firstly, we dispute that because we think the likelihood of those disabled children being born is substantially higher because those parents have the same genes. But secondly, that's a huge burden on their family, it's a huge burden on their society. But lastly, it's a huge burden on that individual when they have to grow up in a community that does have the ick factor that Kelly talked about, that gets freaked out when they find out that kid's brother is also their father. We think that's problematic. Is that even possible? I don't know. You could be like uncle and father, that would be better. Okay, so onto our static about social isolation. We think that particularly in terms of that reaction, that ick factor, this is problematic. Just think about the way that Victorians talk about Tasmanians. It's the same thing. So, we think that the state should protect people from this backlash. Why? Because they're fundamentally harming themselves. We think these are the people who are likely to be isolated, they're likely to be left out. We think that that has its own impacts. But moreover, the kinds of places where we see incest actually happening the most are small, religious, tight-knit communities that are extremists. This doesn't happen just like, you know, when love blossoms randomly like Kelly told you. We think it happens in specific areas. So when people who live in small, isolated religious communities in the United States somewhere don't have any protection, they're in trouble. Why? Because there's no one that they can talk to. There's no one to subvert that problem. There's no one to say this isn't okay. The entire base of people they rely on are part of the family that is in turn part of their intimate relationship. We think it's up to the government to emancipate these people, to give them an option to see that things don't have to be like that, and that's particularly important. Very briefly on medical issues. This is about more than just your kid having 4 heads or 3 feet. There is an increased likelihood when both of your parents have the same gene of your child having some kind of recessive disease, like red hair, or motor neuron disease, or things like cystic fibrosis. It isn't just about not letting people breathe. It's about making sure that everyone has equal capacity in all of these relationships. For those children, they're disadvantaged because of the way society judges them. But for those people in the relationship, they're disadvantaged because there is coercive relationship there, there's no consent, and they can't leave them. And for those reasons, we're more than happy to keep banning incest.
Thank you, Nick, for your speech. I'd like to call upon the final speaker on the feminine team.
Okay, so Rashad told me to be really clear so that every new person knows what the structure of a debate is like. Here is my rebuttal. My first point is about the ick factor. So, Michael told you on the negative team that the ick factor is there for a reason. We should not allow incest because of this ick factor. Well, 20 years ago, sir, it was there was an ick factor against engage